Move to item 6, information agenda item, board education session. Welcome.
Good morning, members of the committee.
Microphone, sir. There you go.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Nice to meet you all in person, finally. It's been a long time. Our suits are a little tighter, less familiar with travel, but we made it. And we appreciate your time. As Doug had mentioned, we'd like to start out just kind of setting the stage. This is something that we've been asked to annually provide as part of the committee's education on compensation governance. And so today we're going to talk about some of the trends that we've been seeing recently, particularly through this pandemic situation that has resulted in some significant stress and pressures on compensation and compensation design throughout the North American market. So what we'll talk about is this new phenomenon that we've experienced over the last 2 years, it's been deemed the Great Resignation. Then we're going to talk about the disrupting force of remote work and the influence that that's had on the workforce. Then we're going to talk about impacts on compensation practices, and particularly we'll get into impacts on public pensions specifically at the end. So when we start out, we talk about the pandemic has had a significant impact on compensation, on work environments, on the fluidity of the workforce, and it's led a lot of organizations to really look at how they're recruiting, attracting, and retaining their talent as they try and continue working their way through this pandemic situation. At our last, I don't know if you recall, but our last session when we talked about incentive trends within North America and in the public sector realm, we talked about the needs, understanding the needs of your employees, the needs of your executive team. And we started out with this Maslow's hierarchy of needs and understanding this from a psychological perspective. The same thing holds true today, and actually it's become even more under the limelight right now, because a lot of organizations have looked at the fact that they have not been addressing the needs of their employees, and as a result have experienced some significant levels of attrition. I'm not saying that this is the case here in CalPERS. I'm saying that it's something you need to be aware of. Okay, this is just a trend that we're talking about. Unfortunately, it's not something that you've really had fallen victim of over the last 2 years. When we talk about the Great Resignation, the term itself was first coined by a Texas A&M professor, Anthony Klotz, and he recognized the fact that en masse there's a lot of employees who have just voluntarily resigned as early as 2021. Not necessarily it was not something that was anticipated. It just started to happen, and as the trend progressed, it started to get exacerbated. Some of the proposed reasons that are out there, and there's a lot of theories around this. We're not saying that any one theory is correct. We're just saying that these are some of the underlying ideas around why we've experienced this phenomenon. First is there's been an increased demand for frontline employees. A lot of organizations have gone through a lot of churn of their frontline employees, both from a health impact standpoint, concern impact standpoint, or even pressures on compensation. Higher wages are one thing that has led to this, especially the front line, because a lot of organizations had to keep moving. They had to keep their businesses going, and so therefore they fell victim to a lot of these pressures. It's less due to government programs, unfortunately, help to exacerbate this because people saw there as some sort of safety net established underneath them. So they could actually resign from their position and have some sort of social assistance, stronger social assistance than what's normally available to help get them through on their day-to-day expenses. And so this also helped to exacerbate this because there was a stronger safety net around them. It forced many to start new businesses or to retire early. So we've seen tremendous movement on the entrepreneurial side, people who have just left their jobs and started up their own small business, oftentimes just running it from their own home. And then also there's an opportunity to move out of what they would see as an unpleasant work situation, and to find what they would deem as more meaningful work. And this is when we talk about needs. This whole philosophy around meaningful work, some people just all of a sudden had an epiphany and said, I don't really align with the work that I'm doing, and therefore I'm going to just resign. And again, oftentimes resigning with this safety net in place, but also oftentimes without even a job lined up, which is a phenomenon that we've never actually witnessed before. And then remote and hybrid work helped to ease many limitations, because people didn't have to go into the office on a day-to-day basis. I'm sure we've all had colleagues or friends that have worked in organizations where they suddenly have had someone all of a sudden sweaty sitting there, and they're like, well, I'm down in the Caymans, or I'm in Barbados, or wherever, working, which of course causes taxation issues and alarms and things that people just never anticipated before. But people felt that if they could work from home, there's a greater sense of fluidity where they could work wherever they could get access to an internet connection. And then this also led to, and this is really interesting, it led to greater opportunities for mid-level employees. And the reason why it did is because of the remote work environment, there was less of an opportunity for organizations to have that one-on-one monitoring and mentoring and training in-house or on the premises. And so therefore, a lot of organizations felt that they could not take risks of hiring someone who did not have experience in that field, in that profession, in that area. And so this created a lot of benefit, or a lot of opportunity for mid-level employees who had experience that was marketable, so that they could actually just go out and quickly get picked up by other organizations. What we do know, and this has gone on long before the pandemic, that when there is some level of attrition, you tend to lose your high performers first. And the reason why is they're the most marketable. They have the greatest track record, and they're in demand, and they know it. And so what ends up happening is, when you have significant levels of attrition, the first line to leave are your high performers. And that's where the risk is, and when you talk about attrition. Again, in terms of the impact on employers, in terms of the Great Resignation, again, this led to high levels of employee turnover. I've seen a number of market studies out there that have said, going into this fiscal year, 2022, organizations should be expecting anywhere between 45 to 55% extra levels or higher levels of attrition than they normally would anticipate. This has, again, created some consternation with organizations trying to manage their workforce. It has forced a lot of organizations to work on greater workplace flexibility in terms of what is the work environment, what are we providing to our employees, what is the expectation in terms of coming into the office or working from home. What are the work-life balance challenges that are around this? And I know when we had our one-on-one meetings with a lot of you, we were just at the beginning of the pandemic, and I'm sure I apologize to a lot of you, because my kids were at home doing, virtual schooling, and at 4 and 6, virtual schooling is not something that they can stay focused on. A lot of parents really struggled with this and had experiences where they were working and at the same time dealing with family pressures and all kind of working underneath this pandemic environment. And then recognition practices really started to hold true here, where they were saying, well, how do we manage and monitor performance? How do we properly and incentivize our employees to get the work done that needs to get done? And then how do we recognize them for actually achieving the performance benchmarks that we put in front of them? And this has heightened the importance of attraction and retention strategies writ large throughout North America. There has been significant compensation adjustments. Most recent market studies here in North America has shown that companies expect most organizations through all sectors of the North American economy expect a median compensation adjustment of about 3%. And this is high across the board. Usually it's around 2% or so. So 3% shows that there's an upward pressure on merit increases strictly for that retention concern that they have. It's also led to adjustments in the incentive structure itself. There's a greater risk of what are called restricted share units in the private sector. A neighbor of mine was just offered an executive position with a large online retail distribution company. I'm sure you can understand who they are. And the offer that he got was 100% retention-based. It was all, time-based, stay in the job, you will receive your incentive. But at no point were there any performance elements in this, which is incredibly unique. I've never seen this before. And all it said to this individual was, stay in this job for the next couple of years, and you'll be paid out every step of the way. As an executive, I've never seen that before. But this is what we're seeing in the market, and we're seeing this in other sectors as well, in terms of the use of time-based restricted awards, which strictly reward the fact that you've stayed in the job for a duration of time. And then also this has led to a greater increase in long-term incentives. And as you all know, long-term incentives are based on the premise of long-term performance expectations, and the ability for you to get that award is prefaced on the fact that you have to stay in that role. So again, it's a retention award that is utilized, and a lot of organizations are realizing the retentive value of their long-term incentives when they look at the overall incentive structures right now. And we all know that attrition has a material impact on organizations. I'm sure if anyone was to talk to Michelle about what is the material impact of attrition in terms of posting a job, finding the resources to do the search, the interviewing. I'm sure all of you went through this when you're looking for your new CIO, finding time to do the interviews, the search. There's a material impact here, and organizations are really waking up to this fact. When we talk about remote work, this is something that has been, we've all read various theoretical novels in the past on everyone's going to work from home and everyone's going to work on the internet and no one has to go in the office and it's going to change the workforce. And that never really materialized until it had to materialize, because we were thrown into this global pandemic situation. And organizations suddenly had this new view of work from home and how it could be managed. And some organizations said, wow, productivity hasn't actually decreased at all, and our employees have been able to get work done. Others have really said this is a struggle and we don't know how to deal with it. And it's led to this bifurcation of philosophies on what is the future environment of work and how is this going to impact the workforce. It was definitely a game changer. It forced a lot of organizations to implement remote work policies and practices and technologies that they hadn't invested in the past. And a lot of organizations really moved quickly. And from an investment standpoint, if you had invested in some of these technologies earlier, you saw some massive escalations in valuation over time, because organizations were looking at what is off the shelf that we can readily implement, that we can utilize, that'll help us to get our work done. It led to flexible employee hours, where people could actually put a load of laundry in between meetings and then come back. But then also it led to employees working easily late into the evening at night, because their laptop's sitting right there and they still have work to be done. My reference earlier about organizations realizing that employees were working outside of the state, outside of their city, outside of their country, and led to some consternation. It's led to some significant issues around taxation, and where your work is actually being completed, and what are your tax obligations in various jurisdictions around the world. A lot of organizations learned the hard way over the last 2 years about those implications and the tax administration around it, which has led to stronger policies around, if you are working remotely, where can you work, or where must you work for us to comply with local, state, or federal tax laws. It also showed employees, as I said, better work-life balance, where you could walk the dog or go out and do a load of laundry or what have you. And it led to more autonomous control over your own time, and some employees really love that. And it led them to say, well, my next employer is an organization that this is what I want to do moving forward. Others have said, I don't feel right sitting at home all day long, and I'd really miss that camaraderie, that team spirit, and I want to go back into the office. But it's led to this bifurcation of the workforce. We've seen some heavy stances. New York, we're the first in New York community, the investment community, banking community have said, if you want New York wages, you're going to come into our New York office and you're going to work in New York. Other organizations like the tech sector have said, work anywhere in the world, work on the beach. We don't care as long as you get your work done. There's extremes on both sides, and I think over time we're going to see some sort of happy medium in terms of a hybrid. But at this point in time, it's still in flux, and it's still something that organizations are struggling through. In many cases, it proved that product work can still get done, even though it's not being done in the office itself. And it's broke down geographic limitations in terms of where you're hiring from. Because if they can work remotely, you don't have to limit your search to your local community. I'm now going to pass it over to Peter, and he's going to talk about the impacts that it's had on compensation practices.
Thanks, Brad. So what is the real impact, especially as it relates to public pension plans? The key thing is more options are now available, so employees have the upper hand in a lot of cases. Oftentimes we're hearing that as you're looking to recruit new candidates, you have to show value, and you have to assume that the candidate has two offers that they're potentially looking at and comparing in terms of the competitiveness of each offering. So it's important to realize that as staff is looking to bring in talent. Relative competitiveness and retention are becoming even more important in today's marketplace. Brad mentioned some of this earlier. You want to make sure you have clear and objective incentive plans. So very clear, what do I have to do to earn that incentive? And if I do that, what is the potential award that I can hope to earn at the end of the day? They're looking at making some improvements, always looking at enhancing their incentive plans, making it easier to understand, making sure that the metrics are relevant to what the person's working on, especially if they're a senior executive and what have you. Tying some of that potentially to the total fund overall results really is a positive thing in the sense that they're working towards, along with the team, towards those collective results. So things like that. And then looking at renewed interest in long-term incentive plans. So looking at a long-term incentive, stretching that out 3, 4, 5 years helps you to retain those individuals, especially as you have overlapping grants over multiple years. That carrot that's out there, especially if you're trending at target or above that sort of 7% threshold, that can become very lucrative. And if someone's going to resign and leave their employer, they're going to be giving up a lot of money by taking that off the table. So that's where the long-term incentive really comes into play. And Brad mentioned this earlier, base salary adjustments, in that 2.5 range historically, creeping up to 3%. We're even seeing organizations going as high as 5% in the private sector because of those retention challenges and making sure that they can adequately compete for talent. It's also looking at, and striking a chord in terms of the importance of those incentive programs. Not having everything be just a fixed base salary, but looking at tying that pay to results specifically on both an annual basis and over the long term. And so recognizing that contribution. There was a recent McKinsey study that looked at employees, they really want good pay and good benefits. They're cognizant of that. They want to feel like they're valued. So beyond just the pay, beyond just earning a fair and competitive wage, they want to feel like they're valued and working on something that is really doing the public good. And that's where I think pension plans can really benefit. And that's why we always say you don't have to pay full Wall Street pay levels. You just have to bridge some of that gap because there are other factors, whether it's the pension program, whether it's the ability to do good work to sustain the pension for members over the long haul. All of those things help in terms of bridging some of that gap, but you need to make sure, of course, you're competitive and within range. And I'll talk about that in a second in terms of figuring out how to measure how competitive you are. You have to set realistic expectations. Make sure that, that minimum expectation is fair and challenging, but also that you're not making that stretch goal too unachievable so that it's not motivating to the individual, so that they're not sitting there saying, oh, there's no chance that we have of making this goal, of hitting this objective, because really then it becomes a disincentive, and they really feel, well, there's not much I can do. Once I hit this certain point, it's going to be, very difficult, if not impossible, to hit that goal. And doing multiple check-in points, and that's why we often say having that mid-year check-in, and I know you do this at CalPERS, and then that final year-end check-in on performance is a really good step, because you're starting to then see, where are we tracking? Where are we falling behind? Where are we also ahead of schedule? What can we do to get things back on track? Things like that. So it's important to always be doing those check-ins, and I think that mid-year check-in is a really good step that CalPERS has put in place. And incentives are less of a fringe benefit and more of a necessity. Asking yourselves, is it what we intended to do? Is it incenting people to achieve the results that we want to achieve? And if for some reason the committee feels it isn't, well, let's make the appropriate changes so that we feel that it is incenting the types of performance that we want. And also, what is our underlying intention? What do we want to get out of this program? What do we want to see our people achieve? And are we comfortable that if they hit this certain level of performance, we're comfortable at the end of the day with them earning that level of reward? If we look at pension systems in particular, they're rethinking their approach. So they're looking at expanded peer groups. If we looked historically, a lot of pension funds, especially those that didn't have as much internal investment management, they would often be very focused on public sector, state agencies, and things like that. But what we're seeing is, as they get more and more complex, as you're bringing in more internal investment talent, as the pool of money goes into the hundreds of billions of dollars, you're seeing these expanded peer groups that, yes, definitely have a very strong impact and weighting on public sector comparisons, but also mix in a private sector peer group. Because, to be frank, in the investment world, you're not just competing with state agencies or public sector or other pension funds. You are competing for talent, both to recruit in, but also losing talent from the private sector. And so it's important to understand where that market is and what those individuals are paying. Again, I remind you, we're not saying you have to go all the way up to the private sector rates. We often, that's why we advocate for a blended peer group, because you're getting that mixture in, and that's a very good comparison, and a lot of pension funds are moving in that direction. And then you have to make sure that the opportunity that you're providing to your people is competitive, and not only through salaries, but also the incentive opportunity. That doesn't mean they're going to earn that full amount of the incentive, but they have the opportunity to earn that level of reward. And so I think that's an important distinction. We're not advocating that actual pay levels should be at the maximum levels. They should only get there if they're achieving the total fund results that you want, if they're achieving the enterprise effectiveness results that you want, the cost results that you want, the individual results. Over the 5-year period, they're beating that 7% return, if not exceeding it, to that 8.4% level. But in making sure that that opportunity is there, that if they do shoot the lights out, they can earn a market competitive level. And if they hit the targets that you've set out, that you're at around that median of your peer group. And if you're doing that, that's going to keep you nice and competitive, and hopefully help in attracting and retaining that talent. Old ways are not working. So old compensation benchmarking, looking at public sector peers, looking at just, say, salary levels or just salary and annual incentives. It's the old paradigm. It's not the way we're looking at it. When someone, especially I'll say in the investment world, but also increasingly in the senior executive world, as you're bringing people in, they're looking not only for that annual salary, they're not only looking at, okay, what annual incentive can I earn, but what's my long-term opportunity? If I stay here for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, what can I potentially earn in that long-term incentive? And they're going to be comparing that, especially if they're coming from the private sector, to what the private sector will pay. And again, we're not saying you have to get all the way there, but the structure of that pay and the opportunity to earn an amount that creeps up and covers some of that gap is key towards making sure that you can bring people in. And then evolving those plans to really focus as well on sustainability. And sustainability, when we typically think of it, is more, we think of it environmentally. It's cutting greenhouse gas emissions. It's cutting environmental incidents. It's being, good on community relations. But in the pension fund sense, sustainability is also about making sure that you have the right talent in place that can ultimately meet that long-term pension promise. And that is a mixture of course, the administration and benefit side of things, but also the investment side, and earning that 7% return over the long run. And so you need the right people in place to make sure that you can successfully hit that 7% return and try to guarantee that long-term sustainability for your fund. When we look at those annual incentive plans, what is the sort of structure? What are the trends we're seeing? Definitely there is a focus on total fund results. That's a key priority. All incentive plans have a tie-in to total fund results. Obviously for those roles like the CIO position, who has sort of influence over the overall strategy, we see a lot higher weighting on total fund results, that one team approach, but at least some weighting, even if it's 15, 20, 25% of that annual incentive needs to be focused on total fund, because you want to make sure that everyone is working as a team and working together towards that common objective at the end of the day. We're also seeing organizations, though, incorporate asset class performance, especially for asset class professionals, those people working in public equities, fixed income, private equity, making sure that they have, again, from a line of sight perspective, in terms of being able to have influence over the results and how they're being rewarded, making sure that you're tying it into their specific asset class that they have more control over as part of that incentive is an important thing. Looking to focus as much as possible the weighting on quantitative performance. And we highlighted that in our incentive metrics review that we'll talk about a little bit later. But that is an area where we're seeing, especially for investment focused staff, 70, 80% weighting on quantitative results, and then leaving that 20, 25, 30% on the qualitative side, because it's not always about just the number of results. It's also recognizing, how did we get there? How did we achieve the results that we did? Are there specific individual objectives that you can't necessarily measure quantitatively? So there is always an aspect of that, but it usually is a lower weighting within most incentive plans, especially in the investment staff. The other focus is long-term incentives. What are some of the trends we're seeing there? Tend to see they're always based on a total fund aspect. You're working towards the long-term results, the long-term performance of your fund. So always focused on total fund, and everyone who participates in the plan, whoever is eligible, is using the same plan. So they're all measured under that same plan over the long term. It typically will include investment professionals, and as well increasingly more and more senior, what we'll call non-investment executives or executive level positions as well. And it typically covers a 3 to 5 year period. So 3 years on the lower end, 5 years definitely on the more longer end of things. And if you look at the chart, the check marks in that table really indicate where it's highly prevalent to see those types of roles participate in such a plan, albeit at different opportunity levels. So the more senior roles will be eligible for more, the more junior levels eligible for less. And then you do see, and this is where we'll get into it a bit as part of the compensation review piece a little bit later, mixed prevalence and eligibility for some of the roles like COO, CFO, Actuary General Counsel. And that's where I think this committee has to have a good discussion to really say, what do we want to do with these roles? Do we want to make them long-term incentive eligible where we see a mixed prevalence? Do we feel like it sends the right message that it's driving towards the results we want long-term? Or are we comfortable as a committee keeping these roles not eligible for long-term incentive for now and really just focusing on that salary and annual incentive piece? You could go either way. We have a preference, and we'll talk about that as part of the compensation review section. But it's something that I think this committee needs to have a good discussion about and make sure that you're all comfortable in whatever approach you want to take moving forward. And then when we look at those senior non-executives specifically, so COO, CFO, General Counsel, those types of roles, they tend to be more prevalent in the leading Canadian funds, which are part of your peer group. They're also highly prevalent in the private sector, so in the private sector part of your peer group. Where they're not as eligible is when you look at state agencies, when you look at other endowment funds, when you look, frankly, at other U.S. pension funds, long-term incentive. You are a market leader in that space. So that's where, again, the debate comes on what do we want to do? Do we want to be more in line with private sector and some of our leading Canadian funds, or are we comfortable, we still want to just be tied to the state agencies and other U.S. funds? That's a debate for this committee to have, but that's, typically where we see the marketplace. And then on the lower end, the associate investment manager That's where you tend to see a lot of times what we call the front office staff, the ones doing the deals and working on the investment specifically, typically being eligible for these types of things. And sometimes the back office staff, more the investment services staff, they're supporting those investment professionals. That's where we see the more mixed prevalence, where you don't necessarily always see those roles eligible in the marketplace. So again, I think it's a good discussion for this committee to have, and we wanted to sort of set the stage as we go to talk about that in a little bit. And I'll pass it to Brad to finish things off.
So as most of you know, Peter and I work with pensions all throughout North America, and we also teach at the state association level and at the federal level with regard to fiduciary duties, trustee, good governance, and compensation and incentive design. And when we get engaged with a new organization, as we did with your organization, we have one-on-one interviews with each of the board members. And when we ask about practices, historic trends, one of the most frequent responses we get is, that's the way we've always done it. That's the way it's always been. This is the way it's always happened, well before my time as a trustee here. And our answer is always, complacency is the kiss of death for any organization, especially for public pensions in an environment like this. Believe it or not, there are still pensions out there that still have the original 60-40 split in their asset classes and are still passively and completely passively managing that. That's dangerous. You've evolved. You've actually changed, and we applaud that. And we see you definitely as a market leader in that aspect. But again, when you look at compensation practices, you can't look at status quo and say that that's always going to cut it. So you always need to be looking at what are the market trends, what are the impacts that you're seeing out there to make you an employer of choice. And that's what you want to be always, an employer of choice where the top talent says, I want to work at CalPERS where I know I can be the best person I can be and reach the realization of my professional capabilities. That's what you want. And so, our recommendations are not based on any one individual or any one constituency need. Our recommendations that we bring forward to you and all our clients are based on the needs of your members and the sustainability of your fund. And I think that's something that you always need to keep top of mind, that this is not a status quo process where you're going to make a decision today and it's going to hold true for the next 10 years and all your predecessors will follow suit. This is something that you need to consistently look at and continue to evolve over time. And with that, that brings us to the end of our education session. Are there any questions with regard to this morning's session?
There are, and thank you for the presentation. Ms. Taylor.
There we go. I'm going to go back. So one of the things I found interesting is that I find it a little interesting that the rethinking in terms of incentive is 3 to 5% from, what, 1 to 2%?
Roughly around.
Oops.
Roughly around 2% annually would be the North American merit increase.
The regular merit increase, and not incentive programs.
Not the incentive,
salary.
just a salary.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is it didn't really go into it other than you're kind of outlining what incentive programs should be focusing on. Is there a from to in incentive programs as well?
Well, what we're seeing most recently, as I mentioned, is that a lot of incentives are really focusing heavily on the retention value and not necessarily on performance, which we don't necessarily agree with. We think that performance-driven programs are the best.
In the investment?
Especially on investment.
Wow.
Because the sustainability and the future lifeline of your members' financial well-being is based on their performance.
Right.
And so you need to always keep that top of mind. So you need to have, achievable, attainable goals that are out there. And this is something we're going to get into in the next meeting in terms of a study that we did. But you need to focus on your performance and have the retention element associated with it. And it's particularly how competitive are you against the general market to make sure, because everyone talks.
Well, so maybe I'm confused here. So I guess the question I'm asking is the from to in the incentive program now is not based in benchmarking, it's more based in retention. Is that what you're saying?
It's heavily weighted on retention right now.
Heavily weighted on retention. So if we have a mix of both, long-term and that kind of thing, that gives us a little more advantage. But what would be, and I guess then that leads me to my next question, what's a retention? What's, besides the long-term, right, is there work-life, you went through the whole beginning that talked about work-life balance, all that stuff. So what is a kind of what you're seeing in the investment world, what is that? Is that more remote working? Is it more just recognition? You said kind of all of it, but what is it in the investment world?
Well, actually, I'm sure a lot of your external money managers, you've seen a lot of fluidity, especially around the ESG teams.
Right.
Because ESG has become top of mind for a lot of investment entities. And so that expertise has become a hot commodity right now. I know of a couple private funds that had their entire ESG teams rated, just taken right out. So again, you need to make sure that you're being fair and competitive on the incentive side. That Peter referenced the McKinsey study. McKinsey study said you need to go beyond this to look at, what is that work-life balance element? What are the mentoring structures that you have in place? Do people have development opportunities that they can leverage and to realize their full potential? These are things that organizations are really starting to recognize, and I'm sure Michelle's team is right on top of that right now in terms of some of these other externalities beyond just the compensation element that we're talking about that have a complementary impact on retention.
Yeah,
So-
I think it is part of, as well, is just setting that sort of career path, especially if you are, as you're recruiting in even more junior level investment staff, having them be able to see the progression and where they can get to in their career. And I think, your policy obviously lays out the compensation opportunities, but, all the other factors, whether it's development programs and things like that, being able to provide, again, flexibility, being able to give them, maybe it's, 1 or 2 days a week at home and then 2 or 3 days in the office. All of those things, I think, are adding to and are being considered a lot more now than solely just the compensation aspect. And one thing that I think pension funds have a really positive case to be made is really the public good that you're doing in terms of, people, working in Wall Street, we're just working to maximize profits. You work at a pension fund, you're obviously working towards the sustainable futures for thousands upon thousands of members. So you have that also, that compelling argument that should help as well in being able to do a little bit more public good than just trying to maximize profits. So it is a combination of different things. And I think it's about making sure that you have that right balance at the end of the day between all the different elements.
Well, ours has always been mission driven, so I think that adds to people wanting to be here, right?
Exactly.
There's a difference. Yes, we may not pay Wall Street wages, but we are mission driven.
Exactly.
So, all right, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ortega.
A question for Brad. Just wondering if you're seeing anything in innovation around measuring, whether you want to call it performance or success on the non-investment side. So one of the things that, I think we've struggled with in the state is looking at, the old style of managing based on being able to see someone in the office and then turning that into how do you manage analytical work or project-based work. And I haven't seen anything yet that's really kind of getting into innovating how you could measure that as an organization. I'm wondering if you've seen anything.
And this is another thing that we teach on is incentive design and incentive trends and the psychological impact of incentives within organizations. If someone can actually come up with a tried and true definitive way of doing that, I think they'll make a lot of money in today's marketplace. But what I am seeing and what we see in all our clients is that an iterative process where you take most of the subjectivity out of it, find ways to establish performance benchmarks or time-based results or something like that you can point to and track over time is something. And then also really focusing on what those objectives are and not having a laundry list. I started my career in the public sector, and as a manager, I was often asked to come up with what are my key priorities, and I'm not exaggerating here. Oftentimes I would have like 3 pages of objectives, and on realistically what was really only like a 4% annual incentive, and so you'd say, well, what's the probability of me really working hard on objective number 52? That's worth 0.0002% of my take-home pay. Very low. But if you can really prioritize, what are the key things we want our staff to do? What do I really need you to do before the end of this fiscal year? And how am I going to reward you for that? That's the way to really come with a narrow and really clear perspective that people can focus on, sink their teeth in, drive, and be rewarded for it. And that's the key thing is, again, trying to find focus within it, and getting away from really long, broad expectations over time.
The only thing I'll add to Brad's point is really about going beyond just the total fund investment return aspect, and that's where we have seen, like CalPERS does, looking at other things like member satisfaction, customer service. Those are areas where on the non-investment side you have control over that in terms of administering those pension benefits, answering members' concerns, and you should be measuring them, because that is the whole other side of the business that's also very important. We look at things like if it's a year where you're doing an asset liability study, pushing that potentially through. Years like this year where you're working on a strategic plan, we've seen organizations look at, do they have sort of confidence in the strategic plan that was presented? Are there lots of questions? Things like that. Looking beyond just the pure investment results at, other areas where the non-investment staff can do good work. And that usually is on the efficiency of the operations, the member satisfaction, the customer service that you're providing, moving forward on that strategic plan, presenting a strategic plan that I think the board has, lots of confidence and a high level of degree of comfort with. All of these things are typically where we see, I'll call it the non-investment staff measured against, in particular, those areas. And then there always is, like we mentioned, a qualitative component. So specific things that you need the general counsel to do or the CFO to do that are specific to their role and responsibility. That's where, typically that individual or qualitative aspect comes in. So there's a lot of things that you're already measuring that I think do a good job of looking at beyond just investment results, what these non-investment staff can have control over on sort of the member side of things, satisfaction, administering benefits, and things like that.
And that's also why when we look at incentive plans, we always like to have that, on the pension side, a total fund aspect to everyone, and I mean everyone's incentive plan. And some organizations will question us on that. But what's most important is that everyone within a pension understand that regardless of what your role is, you will have an impact on that bottom line. If you're driving inefficiencies within your team, your department, within your own budget, that takes away from investment opportunities for your members that can get rolled over time and snowball into higher funded status, and that's the real aspect that a lot of organizations, a lot of pensions are starting to look at, is say, regardless of what your role is, you will have an impact on this bottom line and our overall annual success, and so therefore we want everyone to be measured on at least part of your incentive on that top line item.
Anything else? All right, Mr. Pacheco.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Brett, and thank you, Peter, for your presentation. My question is actually back on page 8 of your presentation, 22, regarding the Great Recession, Great Resignation, and the impact on employers. You mentioned, I think it was that there's a high turnover in the private sector, but how is it in the public sector? And do you see that trend happening more in the public sector, especially in our world, in the public pension world?
This is a phenomenon that we've seen through all sectors of the North American economy. So it's not just the public or the private or retail versus IT. This is something that we're seeing throughout the entire North American market right now.
And you see it as a trend, over the next foreseeable future?
I don't think anyone really knows if there's going to be an end to this. There's various theories that this is the great awakening of the workforce. I don't know. Is this Is this a repercussion of people, having to work from home for months on end? I don't know. I don't think we ever will know until we get out of this pandemic situation, and the new work environment, it becomes normalized. So I think the expectation is there will be some flex going on, some instability over the next little while. But I think as things start to normalize, you're going to see organizations start to, institutionalize what is that work expectation, being hybrid, remote, internal, external, and then they're probably going to, rationalize how much office space they still need or what have you. There's going to be a lot of that reconciliation that's going to happen over time, but I can't predict where this is going to go, because I think we can all say we're in uncharted territory right now.
Oh, I totally agree with you with that. That's respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Paquin.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Brad, I was curious about a couple of things that you said earlier on in the presentation. And, at CalPERS, we have a one fund approach, which I think is important because we're all trying to get to the discount rate and ensure the long-term sustainability. But I think you started off the presentation by saying that right now employers are nervous about losing their top talent. And how do you reconcile the one fund approach versus the need to try to use these incentives to hold on to the top performers? And I think you mentioned your anecdote about your neighbor, and I have a relative who I think works at the same company. And I think the reason why they don't have any performance metrics in those incentives is because if you don't perform, you're gone. And, at a public fund, it's a little bit different. So how do you reconcile that approach?
It's a very interesting question. Well, what I can say is that Peter and I have been quite vocal since day one, working with your organization about the one fund philosophy. We feel that a fund performance element is very key, as I just mentioned, for everyone's incentive, both short and long term, because that's what you're focused on, is your long-term sustainability and hitting that actuarial benchmark on an annual basis. That is going to keep this pension sustainable and allow you to meet your pension promise over time. However, we look at it and we say that you do need to have an element, especially to recognize individual or team-based performance. And this is something we're coming back to this committee on in terms of reintroducing asset class performance to recognize individual and team performance, because that is very important to differentiate your true top performers versus your non-performers. And on the trend, the public pension trend of, as you referenced, the possibility of being terminated if you're not a non-employer or a non-performer, we can honestly say that most of the so-called transformed funds in the market today have adopted that philosophy. If you don't perform, you will be asked to leave. If you don't comply with our investment policy and due diligence practices, even though you have some autonomy on the investment side, if you breach that responsibility in any way, automatic grounds for dismissal, and they are dismissed and walked out. It's a different mindset, but it actually really helps to reinforce that accountability model and the performance expectations of your team. You're seeing a much more, I wouldn't call it a professionalization, but more of a private sector practice or market practice within these investment entities, because they see themselves not so much as public pensions, but really competing investment entities. Because at the end of the day, CalPERS is competing against the BlackRocks of the world, right? When you're going after an asset, there's thousands of funds out there, both public and private, that are after the same assets, and the opportunity doesn't actually play favorites here. So you need to find a way to be as competitive and as opportunistic as you can to, again, protect that pension promise that you've made to your members.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Middleton.
All right. Thank you. Brad, Peter, I want to go a little bit different direction with a question.
In public service across the U.S., and I suspect across North America and in many other places, it's an increasingly angry environment, and we see various places where that's playing out. And for those who are in public service, they're finding themselves exposed to significantly higher contention and frustration with their work being expressed, certainly compared to what I remember when I started too many decades ago. That has a significant role to play in terms of how satisfied people are with their work. If you don't feel like you can ever succeed, it makes it very frustrating to go back at it. Are there organizations that you're finding that are doing a better job of providing better insulation or better protection for their staff, or just simply better communication with the stakeholders so that there is some diminished anger that our staff has to face?
Ms. Milton, ironically enough, I can share this. When I started my career with the Canadian Federal Public Service, I worked on the renewal of the Canadian Federal Public Service, and I helped to spearhead a group that created a number of recommendations and ultimately made recommendations from a youth perspective in what we'd like to see. And one of the key things we said was, and this is years ago, I think this is in the 90s, we recognize this exact trend, and that the media, unfortunately, their mantra is if it bleeds, it leads, and they want to expose everyone's skeleton, and that's what everyone wants. And the public service, philosophically, I can say, having worked in the public service for well over a decade, the public service has allowed that to happen, and has never really got a handle on talking about the social good and the impact that it provides communities, states, countries. And it's allowed this negativity to prevail over time. So can I point to one organization? No. What I would encourage you to do is to start to objectively track. And this is a conversation we've had with all of you when we first started, which was understand the facts, understand the numbers, understand how to defend the decisions that your board is making on the compensation and governance side, so that when there are the naysayers out there that are throwing out skewed data or misinformation or old data that no longer applies to what's being discussed today, you have the wherewithal and the objectivity to refute that in public and to communicate better with your members to say, this is what the perception is, or this is what you might have heard, but here's the underlying principles behind it, and here's how we compare objectively to the market, and here's how we're protecting your pension promise, and here's how we're shoring up the performance and the accountability framework within our organization to guarantee you get the returns you need. And if you can do that in an objective way, as we always say, you're taking the wind out of the sails and the naysayers, and you're actually, truth has power. And so speak the truth, know the truth, and I think over time, be proud of it, and over time, I may be an optimist here, but over time, I think people, and as Peter had mentioned, youth, and this is way before the pandemic, studies came out that recent graduates were willing to take up to a 30% pay cut in their first job if it had purpose. This is a purpose-driven generation that we have now, and if you can show your purpose and amplify that and show how you're making impacts, then I think you will not have a problem in attracting and retaining the talent you need.
Thank you.
Thank you. No other requests to speak? Thank you. Anything else on this item? It's not.